The trial of Socrates stands as one of the most defining moments in the history of Western philosophy. In the year 399 BCE, Socrates, the enigmatic thinker of Athens, found himself standing before the city's court, facing charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. This was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of profound philosophical defiance. As he defended himself against the accusations, Socrates remained unwavering in his commitment to truth and reason, refusing to abandon his principles even when confronted with the ultimate penalty, death. His final words, as recorded by his students, reflected his unyielding belief in the immortality of the soul and the pursuit of wisdom, setting the stage for centuries of philosophical inquiry. His trial and execution became emblematic of the struggle between independent thought and the structures of power, ensuring that his legacy would endure far beyond his lifetime. Socrates remains one of the most influential figures in history, not because he wrote great treatises or left behind a body of written work, but because his ideas and methods transformed the way people think about knowledge, morality, and existence. His impact resonates through the works of his disciples, such as Plato and Xenophon, and has shaped the course of Western philosophy. His dialectical method, now known as the Socratic method, continues to be a fundamental tool in education, law, and ethical discourse. Despite his execution, his ideas flourished, demonstrating that the power of thought can transcend the constraints of political and social persecution. But who was Socrates, truly? Was he merely a philosopher, or was he also a political martyr and cultural enigma? Understanding his life, teachings, and the world in which he lived requires us to step back into 5th century BCE Athens, a city at the crossroads of philosophy, democracy, and war. The Athens of Socrates was a city in its golden age, basking in the aftermath of its triumph over the Persian Empire and establishing itself as the cultural and intellectual hub of Greece. It was a time of extraordinary growth, with democracy taking shape under the leadership of Pericles and the arts flourishing through the works of playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides. However, it was also a time of intense political rivalry, social stratification, and military conflict, particularly with the looming Peloponnesian War against Sparta. Amidst this backdrop, Socrates emerged as a distinct figure, questioning the norms and beliefs of his society. His paradoxical assertion, "I know that I know nothing," challenged the foundations of knowledge and wisdom, forcing his fellow Athenians to confront their assumptions and biases. This approach, which sought to expose contradictions and refine understanding through dialogue, often put him at odds with the political and intellectual elite of Athens. This documentary seeks to explore Socrates not just as a philosopher, but as a complex historical figure who straddled the line between defiance and submission, wisdom and ignorance, martyrdom and intellectual rebellion. His life is a testament to the transformative power of ideas and the risks associated with challenging the status quo. By examining his world, his teachings, and his ultimate fate, we aim to uncover the full scope of his influence and the enduring relevance of his philosophy in today's world. To truly understand Socrates, one must first understand the city that shaped him. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a beacon of culture, philosophy, and democratic ideals, yet it was also rife with contradictions. The city had emerged victorious from the Persian Wars, establishing itself as a dominant force in Greece. With newfound power and wealth, it undertook ambitious architectural and artistic projects, including the construction of the Parthenon and the patronage of great playwrights and sculptors. Yet this golden age was not without its challenges. Athens' imperial ambitions led to conflicts with other Greek city-states, culminating in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a struggle that would ultimately contribute to its decline. Politically, Athens was a radical experiment in governance. Democracy, as practiced in Athens, granted citizens, free male Athenians, the right to participate in decision-making through the Assembly and the Council of 500. However, this democracy coexisted with an aristocratic class that wielded considerable influence, and the majority of the population, including women, slaves, and non-citizens, were excluded from political life. The balance between democratic ideals and oligarchic tendencies created an environment where political intrigue and factionalism were common, setting the stage for the eventual trial of Socrates, who was accused of undermining the city's values. Intellectually, Athens was a hub of ideas. The Sophists, itinerant teachers of rhetoric and persuasion, held sway in the city, teaching ambitious young men how to argue effectively in court and public assemblies. Their emphasis on relative truth and persuasive speech stood in stark contrast to Socrates' relentless pursuit of objective knowledge and moral integrity. Meanwhile, pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaxagoras laid the groundwork for scientific and metaphysical inquiries that would later influence Socratic thought. Poetry, drama, and public discourse were integral to Athenian life, fostering an environment where questioning and debate were both celebrated and scrutinized. Beyond politics and philosophy, daily life in Athens was vibrant and multifaceted. The agora, the bustling marketplace, was not only a center of commerce, but also a gathering place for intellectual and political discussions. Citizens engaged in public debates, attended theatrical performances, and participated in religious festivals dedicated to gods like Athena and Dionysus. This was the world in which Socrates lived, walked, and conversed, using the city itself as his classroom and its people as his students. However, his method of questioning, which exposed ignorance and challenged conventional wisdom, often provoked hostility and resentment, planting the seeds for his eventual condemnation. Socrates was born in 470 BCE to a humble family in Athens. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason, and his mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife, an occupation Socrates would later metaphorically liken to his own role in guiding others toward intellectual birth. Unlike many of his aristocratic contemporaries, Socrates received no formal education in rhetoric or writing. Instead, he cultivated his mind through self-directed inquiry and conversation. Though he lived in a time when written works were gaining prominence, he left behind no written records, relying instead on oral discourse, a practice that his disciple Plato would later immortalize through his dialogues. Descriptions of Socrates' appearance and personality vary. By most accounts, he was physically unremarkable, even considered unattractive, with a broad nose, protruding eyes, and an unkempt appearance. Yet, his charisma and intellectual presence overshadowed his lack of conventional beauty. He was known for his sharp wit, humor, and ability to expose the flaws in others' reasoning, making him both a revered and reviled figure in Athenian society. Socrates' life was not confined to philosophical debate. He served as a hoplite in the Athenian army, participating in key battles such as Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. His bravery on the battlefield, particularly his actions in saving the life of Alcibiades, a future Athenian leader, demonstrated that his commitment to virtue extended beyond theoretical discussions. In his personal life, Socrates was married to Xanthippe, a woman whose reputation for sharp temper has made her a legendary figure in philosophical history. Though often depicted as a shrew, she may have been a strong-willed partner who challenged Socrates' unconventional lifestyle. Together, they had children, but Socrates' dedication to philosophy often took precedence over familial responsibilities. Despite his lack of wealth or political office, Socrates played an active role in Athenian society. He engaged with citizens of all ranks, questioning politicians, poets, and craftsmen alike. His relentless pursuit of truth and virtue, however, made him a controversial figure, ultimately leading to the accusations that would seal his fate. As we delve deeper into his life and trial, we will uncover how a man who sought wisdom above all else became one of history's most famous martyrs for free thought. Socrates' approach to philosophy was revolutionary, and at the heart of it lay the Socratic method, a technique of dialectical questioning aimed at uncovering deeper truths. Unlike the rhetorical persuasion of the Sophists, Socrates did not claim to teach knowledge, but instead sought to expose ignorance and stimulate critical thinking. The Socratic method involved a structured dialogue in which he would ask probing questions, challenge assumptions, and guide his interlocutors toward self-discovery. This logical examination forced individuals to recognize contradictions in their beliefs, pushing them to refine their understanding rather than relying on traditional or superficial explanations. The pursuit of truth for Socrates was a lifelong endeavor. He famously rejected conventional wisdom, arguing that many people who claimed to be knowledgeable were, in fact, ignorant. His assertion that the only thing I know is that I know nothing was not a declaration of futility, but an invitation to continuous inquiry. He believed that true wisdom came from acknowledging one's own limitations and engaging in rational discourse to expand understanding. This perspective often put him at odds with the Athenian elite, who viewed his relentless questioning as disruptive rather than enlightening. Socrates' method and philosophy are best illustrated through his famous dialogues, as recorded by Plato. In Euthyphro, he engages in a discussion about the nature of piety, demonstrating how definitions based on tradition and religious authority often fail under scrutiny. In Meno, he explores the concept of virtue, using a slave boy to illustrate his theory of recollection, which suggests that knowledge is innate and merely needs to be uncovered. Through these dialogues, Socrates exposed the flaws in conventional thought and demonstrated the importance of rigorous philosophical inquiry. One of Socrates' most significant contributions to philosophy was his connection between ethics and virtue. He argued that knowledge and moral goodness were inseparable. Those who truly understood what was good would naturally act accordingly. This idea stood in contrast to the prevailing notion that morality was dictated by laws or divine command. Instead, Socrates believed that virtue was a form of wisdom, and that ignorance was the root of wrongdoing. This emphasis on self-examination and ethical conduct laid the groundwork for later philosophical traditions, particularly in the works of Plato and Aristotle. Socrates' philosophical approach was distinct from that of the Sophists, who were professional teachers of rhetoric and persuasion. While Sophists believed in the relative nature of truth and often taught their students how to argue effectively regardless of moral considerations, Socrates sought absolute truth through reasoned dialogue. This fundamental difference led to tensions between him and the Sophistic movement, as he accused them of prioritizing persuasion over genuine understanding. By challenging their relativism and exposing their inconsistencies, he positioned himself as a defender of objective knowledge and virtue. Socrates' influence extended far beyond his contemporaries. His impact on young intellectuals was particularly profound. Among his most famous followers were Plato, Xenophon, and Alcibiades, each of whom played a significant role in preserving and shaping his legacy. Plato, inspired by Socrates' methods and teachings, went on to establish the academy and write extensive dialogues that immortalized his mentor's philosophical inquiries. Xenophon, though less philosophically rigorous than Plato, provided another perspective on Socrates' life and ideas through his memorabilia. Alcibiades, a brilliant but controversial political figure, admired Socrates' intellect and character, though he ultimately pursued a path of political ambition that diverged from Socratic principles. One of the most controversial aspects of Socrates' teachings was his tendency to challenge traditional authority. He did not hesitate to question widely accepted beliefs about the gods, the Athenian democratic system, and societal norms. His inquiries into religious matters, particularly his discussions about divine justice and morality, unsettled those who adhered strictly to traditional mythology. Additionally, his critique of democracy, where he argued that unqualified individuals should not be entrusted with governance, made him unpopular among the ruling elite. By questioning the foundations of Athenian society, he inadvertently positioned himself as a subversive figure. This led to the perception that Socrates was corrupting the youth of Athens rather than enlightening them. Many elders feared that his relentless questioning was eroding respect for tradition and authority, fostering a generation that challenged the status quo. The accusation that he was leading young men away from piety and loyalty to the state became a central argument in his trial. However, Socrates saw his role as that of a philosophical midwife, helping others give birth to their own ideas rather than imposing doctrines upon them. A significant ideological battle played out between Socrates and the Sophists, as both sought to shape the intellectual landscape of Athens. While the Sophists emphasized rhetoric, persuasion, and the relativity of truth, Socrates prioritized reason, virtue, and absolute truth. This fundamental difference in approach led to deep philosophical divides. Whereas Sophists trained students in the art of persuasion to gain political and social advantage, Socrates encouraged his followers to seek wisdom for its own sake, regardless of personal gain. This contrast made him a polarizing figure and further fueled the tensions that would eventually lead to his condemnation. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial, facing two primary charges: impiety and corrupting the youth. The charge of impiety stemmed from accusations that he failed to recognize the traditional gods of Athens and introduced new deities. His association with the concept of a divine voice, or inner guidance, was viewed with suspicion. The charge of corrupting the youth was based on his influence over young men, whom his detractors claimed he led away from conventional beliefs and civic duty. These accusations, however, were as much political as they were philosophical. Socrates' method of exposing ignorance had made him many enemies, and his refusal to conform to societal expectations placed him in direct opposition to those in power. The political climate of Athens at the time of Socrates' trial was tense and unstable. The city had suffered a devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, leading to a period of oligarchic rule, known as the 30 Tyrants. Although democracy was eventually restored, the trauma of war and internal strife left Athenians wary of figures who seemed to undermine civic unity. Socrates, who had associated with some members of the oligarchy, became an easy scapegoat for those seeking to stabilize the city. Socrates' defense, as recorded in Plato's Apology, was a powerful testament to his commitment to philosophy. Rather than pleading for mercy or attempting to refute the charges with flattery, he maintained his characteristic defiance. He argued that he had spent his life in service of the city by challenging its citizens to think critically and live virtuously. He compared himself to a gadfly, whose persistent questioning was necessary to keep Athens intellectually alive. His unwavering stance demonstrated that he valued truth and integrity above personal safety. Despite his eloquent defense, the jury found him guilty. By a relatively narrow margin, they voted for his conviction. When given the opportunity to propose an alternative punishment, Socrates, rather than showing remorse, suggested that he should be rewarded with free meals in the Prytaneum, a privilege typically reserved for Olympic champions. This perceived arrogance angered the jury, leading them to sentence him to death by an even larger margin. The trial of Socrates raises profound questions about the relationship between philosophy and democracy. Was he a genuine threat to the system, or was his execution an act of intellectual suppression? His trial and subsequent death underscored the fragility of free thought in a society that claimed to value open discourse. By choosing to accept his fate rather than fleeing into exile, Socrates solidified his status as a martyr for truth and critical inquiry. His death, rather than silencing his ideas, immortalized them, ensuring that his legacy would shape philosophy for millennia to come. Socrates' final days in prison were marked by deep philosophical discussions, particularly those recorded in Plato's Crito. As he awaited execution, his friend Crito visited him, urging him to escape and live in exile. Crito presented several arguments. Socrates had been unjustly condemned, his death would bring grief to his friends, and by refusing to flee, he would be failing his duty to his loved ones. However, Socrates, unwavering in his commitment to principles, rejected the idea. He argued that escaping would contradict his lifelong teachings on justice and civic duty. By accepting the verdict, even if it was unjust, he upheld the integrity of the law and demonstrated that morality must transcend personal survival. The execution of Socrates remains one of the most dramatic moments in philosophical history. As depicted in Plato's Phaedo, he was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock, a potent poison. Surrounded by his followers, Socrates maintained his calm demeanor, discussing the immortality of the soul in his final hours. His composure stood in stark contrast to the grief of his disciples, who were devastated at the loss of their teacher. When the time came, he drank the poison without hesitation, remarking on the effects as his body gradually succumbed to paralysis. His final moments were neither of fear nor regret, but of intellectual inquiry, embodying the philosophical ideals he had lived by. Socrates' last words, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius," have been the subject of much interpretation. Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, was often honored with sacrifices by those who had been cured of an illness. Some scholars believe Socrates was suggesting that death was a form of liberation, a cure for the soul from the burdens of the physical world. Others interpret it as a final act of piety, indicating that despite his trial for impiety, he remained connected to religious traditions. The meaning of Socrates' death has been debated for centuries. Was he a martyr who died for philosophy, or did his execution represent a triumph of intellectual conviction over fear? His refusal to flee, his composed acceptance of fate, and his final philosophical discussions all point to a man who lived and died, according to his principles. His execution did not silence his ideas. Rather, it immortalized him as a symbol of intellectual courage and the pursuit of truth. Socrates' legacy is largely shaped by his most famous student, Plato, who immortalized him in a series of dialogues. Plato's Socrates is not just a historical figure, but a literary and philosophical construct, used to explore profound ideas on ethics, politics, and epistemology. Through works such as the Republic, Apology, and Phaedo, Plato presents Socrates as an unwavering seeker of truth, a man devoted to reason and justice. These dialogues ensured that Socratic thought would influence Western philosophy for millennia. Another account of Socrates comes from Xenophon, an Athenian historian and soldier. While less philosophically sophisticated than Plato, Xenophon provides a more practical depiction of Socrates. His works, such as Memorabilia and Apology, portray Socrates as a moral teacher and a pragmatic thinker. Xenophon's Socrates is more focused on ethical conduct and civic responsibility, lacking the deeper metaphysical discussions found in Plato's accounts. This alternative perspective provides a counterbalance to the idealized figure in Plato's writings, offering a different lens through which to understand Socrates. Socrates' influence extends far beyond ancient Greece. His emphasis on questioning assumptions and seeking rational explanations laid the foundation for many later philosophical movements. Existentialist thinkers, such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, grappled with his legacy, exploring themes of individual responsibility and the nature of truth. In ethics, his insistence on the connection between knowledge and virtue influenced moral philosophy, while in political thought, his critiques of democracy sparked ongoing debates about governance and justice. The impact of Socratic ideals on Western thought is profound. His commitment to rational inquiry, intellectual humility, and free speech became foundational principles in the development of science, philosophy, and democracy. The Socratic notion that knowledge begins with recognizing one's own ignorance is a core tenet of modern critical thinking. His ideas continue to shape contemporary discourse on ethics, justice, and human nature. The Socratic method remains widely used today, particularly in education and law. In classrooms, it fosters critical thinking by encouraging students to question assumptions and engage in structured debate. In legal practice, the method is employed in courtroom arguments and cross-examinations, where lawyers use questioning to reveal inconsistencies in testimony. Beyond these fields, Socratic questioning remains a powerful tool for problem-solving and intellectual exploration. One of the enduring controversies surrounding Socrates is the question of whether he was a real historical figure or a literary creation. Since he left no written works, our understanding of him is based on the writings of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. While most historians accept that Socrates was a real person, the lack of direct evidence makes it difficult to separate the historical man from the philosophical construct created by his followers. A related debate centers on the differences between Plato's depiction of Socrates and the real man. Plato's dialogues often use Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own philosophical ideas, especially in later works where Socratic thought merges with Platonic theory. As a result, some scholars argue that the Socrates in Plato's early dialogues is closer to the historical figure, while the later dialogues reflect more of Plato's own philosophy. Socrates' relationship with religion is another subject of discussion. He was accused of impiety, yet his references to a divine voice suggest a form of spiritual belief. Was he a hidden believer who sought a deeper understanding of the divine, or was he a skeptic who used religious discourse as a rhetorical tool? His trial and execution raise questions about the intersection of philosophy and faith, and whether his unorthodox views on the gods contributed to his downfall. Despite his reputation as a champion of wisdom, Socrates was not without his critics. Some saw him as arrogant, believing he humiliated others with his relentless questioning. His focus on intellectual pursuits over political engagement led some to view him as detached from the practical concerns of Athenian life. His disdain for democracy and association with controversial figures like Alcibiades further complicated his legacy, raising questions about whether he was an elitist who underestimated the common people. From Athens' perspective, executing Socrates may not have been entirely unjustified. In a city recovering from war and internal strife, his teachings posed a challenge to the fragile stability of democracy. His questioning of traditional values and influence over the youth were seen as threats to civic harmony. While his execution is often viewed as a tragic suppression of free thought, it can also be understood as an act of self-preservation by a city struggling to maintain order. Socrates remains one of history's most complex and enigmatic figures. His life, trial, and death continue to inspire philosophical inquiry, while debates about his legacy ensure that his influence endures. Whether seen as a martyr for truth or a disruptive force in Athenian society, his impact on human thought is undeniable, securing his place as one of the most significant thinkers in history. Socrates has been a compelling figure in literature and popular culture for over 2 millennia. His legacy extends far beyond philosophy, influencing drama, literature, cinema, and even modern pop culture. His unique method of questioning, his enigmatic personality, and his tragic death have made him an enduring subject of artistic and intellectual exploration. One of the earliest literary depictions of Socrates is found in Aristophanes' play Clouds. Written during Socrates' lifetime, the comedy portrays him as a ridiculous sophist who corrupts the youth with absurd teachings. In the play, Socrates is depicted as a pompous intellectual who runs a thinkery, where students are taught how to use deceptive reasoning to evade moral and financial obligations. Aristophanes' portrayal is largely satirical, exaggerating Socrates' questioning nature to mock the growing influence of philosophers in Athens. While not a historically accurate representation, Clouds contributed to the public perception of Socrates as a subversive thinker, which may have played a role in his eventual trial and execution. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Socrates experienced a revival in European philosophy. Renaissance thinkers, inspired by the rediscovery of classical texts, saw Socrates as a model of intellectual integrity and virtue. Humanists such as Erasmus praised him as an early champion of reason and individual inquiry. During the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau viewed Socrates as a martyr for free thought, drawing parallels between his fate and the suppression of reason in their own times. His dialogues, particularly through the works of Plato, became essential texts for understanding rational inquiry, skepticism, and ethics. Socrates' influence can also be found in modern literature and films. Writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky and George Bernard Shaw explored Socratic themes in their works, using characters who challenge conventional wisdom through relentless questioning. In cinema, Socrates has been portrayed in films such as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where he appears as a wise yet humorous figure, and in more serious adaptations like Socrates, 1971, by Roberto Rossellini, which depicts his final days with historical accuracy. His philosophical ideals have also influenced dystopian fiction, where societies that suppress free thought echo the circumstances surrounding his trial. Beyond literature and film, Socratic philosophy permeates popular culture in various forms. Many fictional characters embody Socratic ideals, questioning authority, challenging norms, and seeking truth. From the wise mentors in classic literature to modern films, Socrates' legacy can be seen in figures like Yoda from Star Wars, Morpheus from The Matrix, and even Sherlock Holmes, whose investigative method mirrors the Socratic pursuit of truth through inquiry. His method of questioning is widely used in legal dramas, investigative journalism, and debates, showcasing its enduring relevance. Socrates remains one of history's most paradoxical figures. Was he truly wise, or was he merely an intellectual troublemaker? His famous assertion, "I know that I know nothing," reflects his humility in the face of knowledge, yet it also serves as a challenge to those who claim certainty. His method of relentless questioning unsettled many, forcing them to confront their ignorance. To some, he was a genuine seeker of truth. To others, he was a disruptor who exposed the fragile foundations of established beliefs. His relevance today is perhaps greater than ever. In an era of misinformation and ideological polarization, the Socratic method offers a powerful tool for critical thinking. His approach teaches us to question assumptions, evaluate evidence, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Whether in politics, education, or personal reflection, the need for Socratic inquiry remains crucial in a world where blind acceptance of ideas can lead to dangerous consequences. Socrates' true legacy lies in his ability to challenge ignorance. He did not seek to impose his own beliefs, but instead urged individuals to think for themselves. His impact is not confined to ancient Greece. His ideas have shaped the foundations of Western philosophy, influenced countless thinkers, and inspired intellectual movements throughout history. His death, rather than silencing his ideas, amplified them, turning him into a symbol of intellectual freedom and the pursuit of wisdom. Reflecting on his life and philosophy, one cannot help but admire the conviction with which he lived. He refused to compromise his principles, even when faced with death. His unwavering commitment to truth and justice serves as an eternal reminder of the power of ideas and the courage it takes to stand by them. Socrates may have been condemned by Athens, but history has vindicated him as one of the greatest minds to have ever lived. His legacy continues to inspire, reminding us that true wisdom begins with the willingness to question everything.